My name is Gordon Stedgink, and I'm coordinator of this class, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual modality presentation. Jordan Boersma really is a friend of HASP. He did a class for us a couple of years ago on the fairy wren bird that is in Papua New Guinea. He showed us how they were caught and all kinds of stuff about the fairy wrens. I don't think Jordan's going to talk about fairy wrens today, but you're going to find another astounding story dealing with birds in Papua New Guinea. Jordan is somewhat of a rare bird himself. He's traveled all over the world, particularly in the South Pacific, Australia, Indonesia, and throughout that area. He's also been to Galapagos and all around the world with his work. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell University in the ornithology lab. He's teaching courses there and has a very exciting life. It gives me great pleasure to present Jordan Boersma. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Gordon. It's good to be with you all. I wish I could be there in person in Holland with the group, and I'm hoping I can do that for a future course. But alas, as Gordon mentioned, I'm teaching a couple courses this semester, so I have to be here in Ithaca presenting virtually. So today, I left this title kind of open-ended, Finding and Conserving Rare Bird Species in New Guinea, because initially when we scheduled this course, there was a scenario where I'd be back from another trip to New Guinea, where I'm planning to look for another species that's been lost to science for a little bit. But perhaps in the future, I'll share a little bit about that because I'm now planning to do that in May and June. But I have this really fun story to tell about looking for this species called the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, which hadn't been documented since the 1800s before our trip back in 2022. Some of you have maybe already seen this in the news, but there are a lot of details that weren't covered in the news coverage that I'm gonna dig into today, and some videos that I'm gonna show you that document our journey to looking for this species. But I'm actually gonna start off talking about, let's see, why is this not advancing? Okay, talking about fairy wrens just briefly. As Gordon mentioned, a lot of my work is focused on fairy wrens. So if you were in my last HASP course, you heard me talk about these species before. And so most of my research involves studying why these birds are so colorful and how they became really colorful, and what this coloration means in the context of mating and competing for resources. So that's still a lot of the work that I do. Actually, it's still probably the bulk of what I do is in this the fairy wren universe. So these are really colorful species that are native to Australia and New Guinea. So if you haven't heard about them before, it's because, of course, these are not backyard birds in the US, but they are backyard birds in Australia and New Guinea. So kind of like the wrens that we have in the US, these are really common small birds that tend to cock up their tail a lot like wrens, which is why I think they're given this wren moniker at the end of their name. But they are quite different from wrens in a lot of ways. One of which is, unlike our wrens, which tend to be really drab and brown, the males of these species tend to be really colorful. And so I first started working with these species in Queensland, Australia, over a decade ago now. But then I got this opportunity in grad school at Washington State University to study fairy wrens in New Guinea. Actually, before I show you that species, I just wanted to show you, and this might be, depending on your connection, it might be just a little bit glitchy. This will be the hardest video to follow potentially because the birds are so small. When I show you videos in the future from our recent expedition, it'll be a little easier to make out what's happening. But what you'll see come into focus here is a small black and red bird called the red-backed fairy wren. And if you have a good connection and a sharp eye, what you might notice is that this fairy wren, this male redback fairy wren, is carrying a bright colored object. It's actually a flower petal. And so one of the things that makes fairy wrens really special is that the males carry flower petals around to females, usually only to neighbor females, not to their social mate. So like a lot of birds, they tend to mate for life. But there's a lot of flirtation that happens outside of the pair bond. Sorry, let me play that. So look for small bird with a pink flower petal. And that one has a yellow flower petal. It's hard to see because these birds are so small. All right, so those are fairy wrens. And so that redback fairy wren is the species I was initially studying, but then I got this opportunity to apply what I learned in the redback fairy wren to this species called the white-shouldered fairy wren in New Guinea. And to be honest, at the time, though I was really interested in fairy wrens scientifically, the reason why I wanted to go study this particular fairy wren was because I just wanted to go to New Guinea. And that's because, for a lot of biologists, New Guinea is kind of the holy grail of adventure and, biological exploration. There are just incredible plants and animals there. For plants, it's the most diverse island in the world. For animals, it's pretty special. There are birds of paradise there, and other birds that, are unique to New Guinea, that are endemic to New Guinea that you don't find anywhere else, including this quite common species in New Guinea, the white-shouldered fairy wren. And so I won't be going into any details on fairy wrens in this course today. That's what I focused on the last time. But just to give you an idea of what I was studying during my dissertation work in this system, we were trying to understand what caused variation in female coloration. So as many of you probably know, it usually is the males that are, showing this really this really gaudy plumage that, makes them stand out to their mates for competing for mates. But in this species, the males do have this contrasting black and white plumage that the black is really glossy, really iridescent. And so it's when you have them in the hand, they kind of shimmer. And in their grassland habitat, this makes them really stand out to mates. And so this is, we call this plumage sexually selected. It helps them compete for mating opportunities. But what's interesting is that in some areas of New Guinea, we see females that look almost identical to their mates. They have this contrasting black and white plumage. And in other parts of their range, the females are kind of drab and brown, which is usually what we see in fairy wrens. So we did a lot of work in this system, and I hope to return to it someday, starting to chip away at understanding what caused this difference in females and what it means. Because it kind of, is a bit unusual to see this kind of variation in females. Okay, so when I was doing this fairy wren work in New Guinea, I was really struck by just how rugged and beautiful this island was. And so these are just some photos that I took around my field sites. So incredible waterfalls, and the snorkeling and scuba diving is really to a lot of folks, the best in the world. The health of the reefs is incredible. This in the bottom right is a skull cave that's been preserved over many centuries, where people in the village when they passed would be preserved in these skull caves along the coast. So it's not only interesting from a nature point of view, but also the human cultures are really fascinating. And it really was the people that made an impact, more than the nature on me. And that wasn't really what I was expecting when I went to New Guinea. I went there to have these really wild, adventurous experiences in nature and be kind of off the grid and do sort of expedition style research. And that was all great. But really what made the place special were the people. And that's both because the hospitality there is beyond anywhere else I've experienced in the world. The people are just incredibly friendly. But also the aptitude of local people to conduct biological studies is really, in my experience, unparalleled. So Generally, I would work with locals in the villages that I was working in. I'd usually bring just one American field assistant with me who would be, there with me the whole time as I traveled between villages. But in each village, I had local people who I trained and worked with over the 4 years of my dissertation research in Papua New Guinea. And the reality is that they didn't really require much training. I had to invest a lot more time into training the American field assistants than I did my New Guinea field assistants, because people there already had this incredible knowledge of their local flora and fauna, and had this really, I think, unique ability to take part in these kind of studies. And so I was really struck by this. And this is really realizing the just immense knowledge that local people have for biodiversity on their land is really what kind of spawned this work that I'm going to tell you about today. So my first field season in New Guinea was back in 2015, and I was doing fairy wren field studies on the north coast of Milne Bay Province, which is southeastern Papua New Guinea. So if you can see my cursor, I'm circling the area where I was working. So I was working on this kind of narrow peninsula, studying that white-shouldered fairy wren species. And I was there for about 5 months, and my brother was living in Malaysia at the time, and he wanted to come down and visit me in New Guinea, and he's a geologist. So I was trying to think of, what I could show him that would be interesting to him, because, of course, I'm really focused on the birds, and that's not really his thing. So I asked my local friends, what would be interesting geologically to show my brother on his brief visit. And they all said Ferguson Island, which is an island that I could see from my field sites on the north coast. On a clear day, I could see these islands called the d'Entrecasteaux Archipelago, which include Goodenough, Ferguson, and Normanby Island. These are really rugged volcanic islands. What makes Ferguson special is that it not only is a really mountainous island, but there is incredible geothermal activity. It sort of resembles Yellowstone. So there are both geysers and these really beautiful prismatic pools. But unlike Yellowstone, where on any given day there are thousands and thousands of people, when you go to Ferguson Island to go see these incredible geysers and pools, you're usually the only tourist there. Instead of boardwalks, you're just kind of following your guide and trusting that he's going to, keep you out of these boiling these boiling springs. So you have to be really cautious walking around in these areas, because there aren't really established trails, and if you just veer a little bit off the beaten path, you can get yourself in trouble. So it's really is a unique place to visit. And so I took my brother there, and we were really just kind of focusing on these geologic sites. But of course, because I'm interested in the birds, I wanted to see some species there while I was visiting, because I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make it back. And the main thing I wanted to see is this Goldie's bird of paradise. So this is a bird of paradise that's native only to Ferguson and neighboring Normanby Island. And it's relatively common, though it can take a little bit of effort to get a really good look at the really, brilliantly plumed males. And so I was asking local people, where we could see these birds. And just to give you a sense of what it's like to both travel to Ferguson Island and to travel around the island, it involves a lot of travel on these small dinghies, often on very rough seas. So this is actually a relatively calm day. I don't have videos of the really kind of scary high seas days, because I was always just kind of holding on for dear life, and I wasn't, taking a camera out. But I'll just play a little bit of this video clip so you just get a sense of what it looks like to travel in this place. Okay, so it can be kind of, backbreaking travel on a lot of days moving around these places. And that's just, to get to Ferguson Island and to get around the island. That doesn't, even show, which I'll show later, what it's like to, hike around this really mountainous island that, doesn't really have many trails to follow. But we were, really wanting to see that one bird of paradise, the Goldie's bird of paradise that I showed you a couple slides ago. And so as we were walking around, I would pull out my field guide and show local people, this is the bird that we're looking for. Do you have it on your land? And then, we could go about arranging going to see the bird on the land. So doing things like this in New Guinea, whether you're a tourist or you're doing research, because the land is almost exclusively privately owned, it involves a lot of checking in with the landowners and making deals that work for all the landowners, making sure everyone is getting some benefit of our presence in these areas. And so this is something that takes a lot of time with doing research in these places, and it's really important to get it right, to make sure that everyone is happy with these arrangements. And so that's a big part of what I do in New Guinea, is just meeting with locals and arranging access to land to study birds. And so while we were chatting with local people about this Goldie's bird of paradise, many pointed to another bird on the same page in our field guide called the blue bird of paradise, which is one of the most famous birds of paradise. It's one that draws people to Papua New Guinea every year. Myself included, I have made a special trip just to see this one bird in the highlands of New Guinea. But it's a bird that's only known from mainland New Guinea. And we were on Ferguson Island, quite far from its known range. And what was interesting is that several times local people would point to this bird and they would say, we have something that's a lot like this, but its tail is a little bit different. Otherwise, it's basically the same. And at this point, I'd already learned that local people had really immense knowledge of the birds on their land. And so, the first time I heard it, it kind of got me excited. But then I thought, well, that's just one person. And I heard it again, and I heard it again. And eventually it started to seem conceivable that there could be a bird of paradise that could be undescribed, not known to science on this island. Because what people would tell us every time was, it looks like this, but its tail is different. We see it sometimes when we go hunting up in the mountains. So it seemed conceivable, because there haven't been a lot of ornithologists visiting these islands, that there could be a new species that was up in the mountains that local people knew about, that hadn't been described to science yet. So this was something that was in the back of my mind for years while I was doing my dissertation work on the white-shouldered fairy wren. Oh yeah, and just to give you a sense of what it looked like when we would arrive by dinghy, by those boats, to a village and ask people about the birds. Typically the whole village would suddenly materialize from in the bush and neighboring houses. We'd be surrounded by kids who were curious what we were doing there. And so we attracted a lot of attention with each of these visits, and everyone was really eager to tell us about the birds on their land. So this idea was in the back of my head since 2015. And so when I went to New Guinea in 2019 for the final season for my dissertation, I made a plan to go back to Ferguson. So I hadn't been back since 2015. But at the end of my dissertation work on fairy wrens, I carved out a few weeks to go back to Ferguson and to hike into the mountains and look for this bird that people were telling me about in 2015. Unfortunately, I couldn't seem to find the same people I talked to in 2015, and I was getting different stories from that point about the bird that we were after. And so when I would point to this blue bird of paradise in the field guide, no one was really confident that there was something that was like that on their land. And because 2015 was the first field season of my dissertation, I was still kind of new to taking field notes, and I was just on Ferguson as a tourist at the time, so I wasn't really taking detailed notes because it wasn't part of my research as to what people were telling me. And so I had a really hard time retracing my steps. But eventually we did make a plan to go up into the mountains and just look around to see what we would find. And so this is what our camp looked like. This is at about 1,000 meters up on a mountain that had never been surveyed by ornithologists before. And as we learned, actually had never, no one had ever been up to this elevation on this mountain, as far as we know in human history. And so, the locals told us that no one in their village had ever been up to this part of the mountain. And so it's, totally virgin terrain, really beautiful rainforest. And there were some incredible birds. However, they were quite difficult to see because this is what it looked like almost the whole time we were there. So we were up here for about 2 weeks. It was raining almost constantly. And if it wasn't raining, we were in the clouds and visibility was poor. The birds were quiet because it was cold and wet. We were cold and wet. The morale was at times very low, despite, some smiling faces in this photo. But we did have a good adventure up there, and we got to try some new and not always very enticing foods like these giant beetle grubs. And so our local guides at some point just started hacking away at a tree with machetes, and a tree that had recently died and the bark was rotting. We wondered what they were doing, and then we started seeing them pulling out these giant beetle grubs and collecting them in a plastic bag. It turns out this is a really highly sought after protein source in the forests on Ferguson Island. And surprisingly, I will say, pretty delicious. So they almost taste a little bit like crawdads when you fry them up. So despite, not looking like the most appetizing thing in the world, they were actually quite enjoyable to eat. And, when you're up in these kind of places for a couple of weeks, the provisions that we bring are really just enough to kind of meet the minimum requirements for calories. So anything like this is just a bonus, and would fuel our searching for birds in this landscape, which is really difficult to trot on because there aren't any trails, and we were our guides were hacking away at vegetation as we were going up these really steep, muddy slopes. So it was really, really hard work. And while we were on this mountain, I had a realization. And so there's this bird called the curl-crested monocode, which is a native bird of paradise to a handful of islands, including Ferguson, which is actually quite common across Ferguson Island. On our recent trip, it was the most commonly detected bird from our trip because we kept track of every bird species that we detected and how many we estimated that we came across. And this is the most common one. But this is what the curl-crested monocode typically looks like when you see it. So it really just kind of looks like a crow in a lot of ways, not particularly colorful. However, I did have one experience where the clouds broke for about 30 seconds when we were up on this, mountain that hadn't been explored before. And the sun hit the wings of this curl-crested monocode, and I kind of caught it out of the corner of my eye. And I saw this brilliantly blue bird in the canopy, this stunted canopy of this mountain. And I had this moment where I thought, wow, could this be this career-defining moment where I find this bird of paradise that's never been described by scientists before, that locals told me back in 2015. And then when I put my binoculars on it, I realized, shoot, that's just a curl-crested monocode. And I've never before seen them in full sunlight because it's so rare to have full sunlight in this habitat. And so I think this is what locals were telling me about in 2015. Because I didn't show them the monocode in the field guide, when they were looking at the birds that I was showing them, I think what they were telling me was that that they have this bird that has these blue wings that they see in the mountains. And it's the same bird that, is commonly around villages that you usually don't get a good look at in full sun like this. So kind of solved the mystery of what that bird was, but in a very unsatisfying way, because, of course, we didn't then end up finding anything new. However, we did publish our observations from this expedition, and we ended up, coming across a number of species that had never been documented on Ferguson Island before. including one species that hadn't been documented for the entire archipelago. And this archipelago is actually it's an area of conservation concern because it's characterized by an unusual level of endemism, an unusual level of birds that are unique just to this archipelago. And there are multinational logging companies that are steadily degrading habitat. And there's concern that there are going to be species that are lost that are unique to these places. And based on our work, it seems that there are a lot of species that ornithologists hadn't previously documented on the island that are there. So we don't even really have a complete understanding of the biodiversity on this island in the greater archipelago. So in this paper, we were just kind of describing the birds that we came across and the ones that were new for the island. We included that we did not observe this bird called the black-naped pheasant-pigeon. So at the time, all we knew about the black-naped pheasant-pigeon is that there wasn't much known about it. And so in my field guide, which is a little bit older than my collaborator, Jason Gregg, this bird wasn't in the field guide as the black-naped pheasant-pigeon. It was considered just a subspecies of a bird called pheasant pigeon that was native to New Guinea. But Jason brought along a new field guide that showed this recent taxonomic split that made the black-naped pheasant pigeon, which is only known from Ferguson Island, a separate and unique species. And so his field guide made it clear that there was virtually nothing known about this bird, that it was collected at some point in the 1800s, and it's now listed as endangered because it hadn't been seen for quite a long time. However, we didn't know until we got back from the trip that it actually hadn't been since the 1800s that it had been documented. And so it was first collected by this man named Andrew Goldie in 1882, who was the one who described that Goldie's bird of paradise that I told you about, which is the original bird that I really wanted to see on Ferguson Island, that kind of sparked this search in a way for species on Ferguson Island. And so Andrew Goldie also shot 2 of these black-naped pheasant pigeons back in 1882 and published a small paper describing this species. And what I show you in brackets here is really all we know about, or all we knew about the species to present day. So what he writes is that he collected 2 specimens at an altitude of over 2,000 feet on Ferguson Island, and he describes the call. And that's all that we know. And just to give you a sense of how much terrain is covered by 2,000 feet here on Ferguson Island. Ferguson Island is about the size of Kauai, and this scale is in meters, but basically everything that's in red or orange here and up is going to be around 2,000 feet or higher. And so all of this is terrain where he could have potentially shot these initial pheasant pigeon species. He doesn't actually describe where he was in Ferguson Island, despite this being a really large island. And so this is all we had to go off of to start thinking about where we might be able to document this species. So our paper, the paper that I just showed you a couple slides ago, came across the desk of John Mittermeier, who had just launched this Search for Lost Birds project with the American Bird Conservancy. And this search is looking for species that haven't been formally documented in 10 or more years. And so formal documentation means either photographs or recording that experts can confirm is the bird in question. And so anything that hasn't been documented in those ways in over 10 years qualifies as a lost bird. And actually, because our bird, the black-naped pheasant pigeon, hadn't been documented since the 1800s, that was toward the very top of the list of species that have been lost for a really, really, really long time. So he got in contact with us because he wanted to plan to look for this species. And so this was back in early 2022, so not that long ago. We started making a plan to go back to Ferguson Island to go look for this species. And the first thing was to get Doka Nasson on board, who I've been working with in New Guinea since 2015. And so much of my fairy wren work that was at times, really difficult work to conduct when you're working these field sites that don't have running water or electricity. And I'm doing some physiological experiments and behavioral studies that require a lot of equipment, and also just really impressive attention spans that Doka has beyond anyone that I've ever encountered in the field. So he really is, the most impressive field biologist I've ever worked with anywhere. And I've been lucky, as Gordon mentioned, to work in a lot of places in the U.S. and in Southeast Asia and Australia in particular. And Doka really stands out as just above everyone else, and as far as his ability to do this kind of work. And so it can be hard to contact Doka because he is not at all connected with his phone to me here in the U.S. So we can go years without chatting with each other. But I was able to finally get him on the phone as we were planning this trip. And once I got him on board, it started to feel possible that we might be able to pull off this mission to go look for this species that hadn't been documented for a long time. And so Doka was with us on the 2019 expedition, and this was us at the end of the expedition when we were touring the local geysers and hot springs. And in 2019, he gave me the greatest honor of my life up to this point. He named his last-born son after me. So this is, the proudest part of my legacy so far in New Guinea, and is one of the reasons among so many that I always plan to keep coming back to New Guinea to continue doing this work and continue these partnerships. So we got Doka on board, which was great. So he was a core member of our team in 2022. And like I said, he just has this skill set that's beyond anyone else I've ever encountered in the field. And so this is Doka, who had found a nest for that crow-crested monocode, that crow-like bird of paradise that I was telling you about. The nest actually hadn't been described before. Nobody really knew what the nest looked like. And Doka spotted one on our trip in 2022, and it was up this really narrow tree up on the highest mountain on Ferguson Island called Oyatabu. And he looked at the nest and he said, "Jordan, I'm gonna put a camera on that nest so we can hopefully see the egg, because no one knows what the egg looks like." And I looked at the nest and I thought, well, that's not possible, Doka. That it's going to be dangerous. The tree is too thin. But he told me, no, I'm certainly going to do this. And he was able to scale a neighboring tree that was just thick enough to support his weight, and put a camera on the nest so we could get a look at what it looks like. And just to give you a sense of his skill set, I'll just let this video play where you can see him just hopping up this tree like it's nothing, and then placing a camera on the nest. And so it's hard to see, but the nest is in a tree that's just to the left of his left knee. If you can see my cursor, it's in here. And so this is just, a snippet of what it's like to work with Doka. He really makes the impossible feel possible. And so, it was really crucial that we get him involved with this trip, because we're looking for a species that hadn't been documented since the 1800s. It was bound to be difficult. And we really needed the best people to join us on this mission. And he's at the top of that list. And this is what the bird looked like when it visited the nest. Unfortunately, we weren't in this area for long enough to document the egg, so we only got videos of it visiting while it was in the building phase of nesting. So here's a monocode visiting the nest, and what you will notice is when it hops from the branch that's currently on to the next branch, it does catch a little bit of sunlight, and you can see that glossy iridescent blue plumage. If you have your volume up, you may have just heard a kind of ghostly call. That's the call of the crow-crested mountain goat, one of the calls they make. You can see that those wings really shining in the little bit of light that's cutting through the mist there. Okay, so the way we went about looking for this species is really tapping into that really immense natural history knowledge that I talked about when I first started talking about what really inspired me about working in New Guinea. And so we knew that if we were going to have a chance of finding this species, if it was still around, which was a big question mark when we embarked on this expedition, the way that we were going to go about finding it was to, find the people who spend the most time in the forest, particularly in remote mountainous areas on Ferguson Island, find them and interview them about what they know about birds. And so what we decided to do is bring cards showing illustrations of 25 different species, some of which we know are on Ferguson Island, most of which we know are on Ferguson Island, some of which we know are not on Ferguson Island, and some that could be on Ferguson Island that we were interested in documenting if they picked those cards. And the black-naped pheasant pigeon illustration was just mixed in with the rest. And so there are a lot of reasons why we approached it this way. One is that we didn't want to really reveal our hand that we were looking for this one particular bird. Because, once you start doing that, whether it's in New Guinea or anywhere else in the world, people might convince themselves they know the bird that you're talking about, especially if they want to be involved in this adventure to go look for this animal. They might talk themselves and talk you into thinking that they know this bird. So we didn't want to bias them into, telling us that they knew this bird if they weren't really confident that it was, on their land. And the reason why we had species mixed into these cards that we know are not on Ferguson Island is that if someone picked out the black-naped pheasant pigeon as a species that they know on their land, but then they also picked a cassowary, which we know is not on Ferguson Island, then we might not trust that they have the most accurate knowledge of the birds on their island, or they might be thinking about a different bird when they pick that black-naped pheasant pigeon card. This is a way for us to kind of weed through the people who would pick out the pheasant pigeon illustration and those who picked out the pheasant pigeon, and then they only picked birds that, conceivably were on Ferguson Island. That combination told us that these were, probably the right partners to go into the forest and go looking for this species. We also played vocalizations for 4 common Ferguson species, and we had a recording from one of the closely related pheasant pigeon species on the mainland mixed in. So we would suspect, based on that description that I showed you from the 1800s of what the call sounds like, we picked a recording that sounded a lot like that of a closely related species. And so if someone, identified that call as the pheasant pigeon, then that was, again, a really good partner to work with, because from what we know about the mainland species, they're really difficult to observe because they're really shy, but they have a really far-carrying call. And so that's the way that they're often documented on the mainland. And so we had a lot of people on our team for this trip, but I think the most key component, except for maybe Doka, but I think even maybe more so than Doka, is Ellie Malesa, who helped us arrange the trip in 2019. And he ended up being our translator on this 2022 trip. So because we were interviewing local hunters across a variety of remote villages, generally people in New Guinea speak really good English, but when you get to these more remote areas and you're talking with people who really spend all of their time in the forest, they often don't speak much, if any, English. And so we needed a translator who spoke a lot of languages, because Papua New Guinea is the most linguistically diverse country in the world. And the villages that we were covering spanned 4 or 5 different languages, and Ellie knows all of these languages, in part, or maybe largely, because he is involved in this shell trading ring that goes back centuries and has been the subject of a lot of anthropological studies in this area. So he's one of few people who is keeping this historic shell trading ring alive. And in order to take part in this shell trade, you need to speak a lot of languages, to be able to communicate with your partners across several different islands in this area. So he is an incredibly skilled translator, and he's also very extroverted, and everybody loves Ellie. He's really well connected. And so even when we weren't doing the interviews, he was often chatting with local people, asking them questions about the pheasant pigeon and, unearthing really important information for us that we wouldn't be able to get on our own, both because we don't speak any of these languages, but also, it's very different for us to, come to these areas as Westerners as it is to for someone who's from there, who already, has trust in these communities. Okay, so now getting into talking about, what it actually looked like to do these interviews and start looking for the species that hadn't been documented since the 1800s. We first came to 3 different villages where we ran through this protocol, and what we found is that people knew their birds really well. So the accuracy of their knowledge was really remarkable, which isn't surprising. I had never directly tested this before, but it was something that I observed initially in my work in New Guinea. So it was great that people knew their birds really well. However, it was not so great that nobody knew the black-naped pheasant pigeon. And so what that told us is that this bird certainly isn't, or most likely is not around these areas, because if people know their birds really well and they don't know this species, that's not a good sign that it's still around. So at this point, we're not feeling too great about our prospects in finding it, but we've only covered a few different villages, and there's still hope. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like to walk around these areas, this video just shows how beautiful Ferguson Island is, how rugged it is, and the views out on the ocean when it's a clear day, which is pretty rare, but it does happen, are really remarkable. But also, it's a really steep mountainous island, and so it can be really slow going to move about this island. So here's a video of us hiking on a really nice day where the morale is high.
Expressing your beauty for the GoPro?
Yeah, yeah. Everything's a performance. There's not a single minute of this trip where I've been genuine.
I was joking with Jason about how I'm recording everything and doing a performance in the process, acting the part of leading this expedition. If you can't hear the audio, it's not important for these initial videos. So here we're walking through a recently cut garden. So this is one of the, oh, and there's Jason takes a spill. It tends to be really muddy and slippery.
No butt touch.
So I wanted to show you that just so you get a sense of what it looks like to move around here, but also because, as the human population is expanding on Ferguson Island, not only is there this threat from, multinational logging companies that are doing a lot of deforestation, but naturally, as these villages are growing, and it's mostly subsistence living, gardens for subsistence living are steadily going further and further into the mountains and encroaching on, what we suspect is the habitat for this bird, the black-naped pheasant pigeon that we were looking for. And so this is what it looked like to hike on a really nice day. Here was another part of our journey where we encountered the worst storm I've ever experienced in the tropics. So I've experienced a lot of very heavy rain, but this straight line wind came in out of nowhere, and it was cracking really large trees and bringing them down around us. You won't see any trees coming down in this video. At some point I start running, and so it's the video is pretty bouncy. It'd be hard to tell what's going on. But what you will see are some leaves swirling about as I pan up to the sky. And initially, none of us knew what was happening, even the local people. We couldn't understand this sound that we were hearing because it almost sounded like the ocean. But we were quite far from the ocean at this point. We were in the interior of the island, and it was this straight line wind that came out of nowhere on an otherwise nice day and just started leveling trees around us. And then it started pouring rain. So I'll just let the video show what it looks like.
Oi. Oi. Oh. Oh.
So that was to give you a sense of the kind of misadventures that are pretty typical on trips like this, where we're often out in these really remote areas and just at the mercy of the ambient conditions, which can turn in a hurry. And so after a couple of weeks of dealing with these kind of conditions and not getting really any positive reports of this pheasant pigeon, we're starting to, the morale was starting to slip a little bit. And so again, at this point, we put in a couple of weeks where we've gone to these different villages. It's hard work to move around these areas, and we haven't heard any reports. But then we finally came to a village where we heard some reports of black-naped pheasant pigeon back in the 80s and 90s. And so that's what BNPP stands for, black-naped pheasant pigeon. So we heard one story from a hunter that they used to hike this trail to the coast through the mountains where they would hear this bird, but they hadn't been in that area since the 80s or 90s, and so they hadn't come across the pheasant pigeon since then. So we didn't really think that much of this initial report. It was just one person. But this is the area that they had referenced, and so it was something that was on our minds. But then we came to another village that was even further into the interior of Ferguson Island, and we heard basically the same exact story from someone else. And there was no scenario where these two people would have communicated with each other. I think these interviews were done either on the same day or a day apart, and we had to cover quite a lot of area between the two interviews. These are different villages, but same exact story. They used to hike this trail to a coastal village to do some trading, and when they would go through the mountains, they would see or hear this black-naped pheasant pigeon. So this is when our ears started to really perk up, and we started to wonder if at least the bird was somewhat recently around. That maybe if it went extinct, that it went extinct in the 90s. Then we came to another village where we heard the exact same story again. So back in the 80s or 90s, we would hike this trail through the mountains, and we had them point to that area on the map, and it was the same area as the other two interview respondents, again from a totally different village. And so this was one of the people we interviewed who had claimed to have caught one in a trap back in the either the late 80s or early 90s. And so this is when we marked this area on the map that he's telling us about.
So Boro Boro is around here, and that's where he trapped the bird.
Okay. We can put an X there.
So this is a really pivotal moment in our trip. This is, I think, when a lot of us started to believe that, you know, we had a chance of documenting this bird. Even though people were saying it hadn't been since the 80s or 90s, the fact that we kept hearing this same story from different people, and that in every case, it was people who haven't been to this area since the 80s or 90s, that told us that, you know, maybe this is a remote enough area, and that if we go in present day, that this bird is still going to be around and we have a chance of documenting it. All right, so with the last, at this point, a little over a week that we had on our trip before we had to go back. So at this point, we're almost a month into our trip. And we decided to take our boat around the island to this village that I'm showing with a white star, which is the closest village to the area that we had circled on the map. So this is what Ellie, our translator, recommended. He said, this is going to be the closest village to this area. Let's go there and see if we can find anyone who knows this bird in present day. And so this is what it looked like getting to our boat. So shortly before recording this video, I'd actually fallen in a swamp. So I was crossing, I don't have a video of it, but I was crossing a log over a swamp and fell in, just to give you an idea of some of the hazards that you deal with on these trips. And this is us, you know, joining up with our friends who are waiting for us with the boat at the coast. You'll see actually a pig that's hiking with a boy on the right here. So this is a little inlet into the ocean that we're walking through. It just gives you a sense of just, you know, how unique this place is.
We're taking the pig with us. We took a track that was not muddy, and I fell in a sago swamp, like all the way up, like deep.
Okay, so this is the moment where we are joining up with our team. We had kind of split apart for a little bit. We're all coming back together, and we have about 8 days left where we're going to go to this last village before this remote area that we had circled on the map. And so now the spirits are starting to be a little bit higher, but there's still a lot of doubt as to whether or not, you know, this bird is still around. So we came to the village that I showed you on the map, and not only did we find people who seem to know the bird pretty well, but they told us that this bird was both had a legend attributed to it, and also was used in a spell that men would use to try to find a wife in the village. So if they had someone in mind who they wanted to marry, they would summon this bird in a spell that was meant to endear them to the woman who they wanted to marry. And so I'll let this recording of the man who told us this spell play in a little bit. But basically, you know, part of the reason why I'm sharing this is, you know, once we started to hear that there were stories about this bird, the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, you know, that told us that, you know, the fact that it's of cultural significance in this area means that, you know, probably at one point it was pretty common. It was an important bird to local people. And so we started hearing this local name called Awo, that if you've seen any news coverage of this rediscovery, you've probably seen that name before. And so what you might hear in this spell is this man saying Awo.
Mabe kakubo, sisineta kakubo. Anyo gui waroi gui waroi, delai gui waroi. Mabe kakubo, sisineta kakubo.
And so that was the spell that he shared that, you know, used to be used to, you know, try to endear yourself to a woman who you wanted to marry in the village. So finally, we had present day reports of the black-naped pheasant pigeon in this village. So we found a couple of people who had claimed to have seen one recently. And so at this point, some members of our team went up into the mountains with one of the people who had had claimed to have recent observations of the species. And Ellie and I went to one last village, or not quite village, but the last couple of houses before this area that we had circled on the map. Because from what we were told, there were some people in these houses who were the ones who were, you know, currently going to this area that we had circled on the map for hunting, and they might be, you know, the ones who really could know this species well and help us, you know, try to find it. So again, our team split up, which, you know, presents a lot of difficulties in places like this where there's no cell phone communication. So while most of our team went hiking into the mountains with one hunter, working with him to try to document the pheasant pigeon, Ellie and I went ahead to these last houses to do some more interviews. And when we got there, we heard even more encouraging reports. So we found one person we interviewed who seemed to know the bird quite well, recognized the call, recognized the illustration, had a lot of recent stories of encountering the bird. And so he seemed like the exact person that we were envisioning, that we, you know, hoped that we would have found early on in our trip, so we'd have some weeks to spend with them trying to document the bird. Because, like I said earlier, we would expect that this is, you know, probably quite an elusive species, given that it hasn't been documented for such a long time, if it's still around. And to add a little bit of drama to this story, when we met with the primary landowner for this area that we had circled on the map, that everyone who knew the bird said, this is where we've come across this species, which at this point was listed as critically endangered, based on the fact that it hadn't been documented for a long time, and most of its presumed habitat has been destroyed on the one island where it's known from. When we told him at the end of the interview what brought us to his land and what we were hoping to do, you know, document this bird, and he realized that, you know, people had come from the other side of the globe just at a chance to document this one species that's on his land, and that everyone pointed us to his parcel of land. Everyone that we talked with on Ferguson Island who knew the bird pointed us to the land that he owns. I could see him showing a look of concern on his face as Ellie was, you know, talking with him in local language about our mission. What Ellie shared with me after they were done talking was that he had recently leased the land to, or signed an agreement to lease the land to a logging company. And so again, given that, you know, all the evidence points to this bird maybe only existing in this one area on Ferguson Island, and potentially it was going to be logged relatively soon. Now we are kind of in a race to try to quickly document this bird to prove that it's still around, that the local knowledge that we've grown to trust, you know, is validated through either photos or recordings. We needed to do this really expediently, so we only had about 5 days left at this point. Okay, so Ellie and I ended up having to hike up into the mountains to go find our friends, and to bring them back to, you know, where we had interviewed this hunter who seemed to know the bird better than everybody else, because this was going to be our best chance, to our mind, in finding this bird. And so this is the moment that we're walking, we're starting our hike to this area that we had circled on the map, where I'm asking members of our team what their confidence level is in finding the bird. So up to this point, I would say many of us dipped down to close to 10% or even 0% chance of finding the bird. Early on in the trip, it seemed like maybe it's gone extinct. Then we started to think that, you know, maybe it's still around, but we probably don't have time to document it. Finally, once we found the right people, we started to believe that, you know, we had a good chance of finding it. So I'll just let this video speak for itself.
John, what is your current percentage on finding it? And these next, we have 3 days to search.
I've had so many highs and lows. Like, I don't want to put it too high and then just be devastated. I'd say 50%.
Okay.
Down from what I was a couple days ago.
Jason?
72.
72. Serena? Percentage we find it?
65.
65? Doka?
Still 80.
80 or 80 to 100?
80 to 100.
Okay. I'm at 70. John is now the lowest. John was the highest before the last trip.
So Doka from the start was the most confident that we were going to come across it. Most of us, we're not feeling great until this moment where we're hiking into this area where that, finally we had really recent reports of the bird and, someone who has observed it quite a number of times. So here's what it looked like to hike into this area. So we crossed, I think it was 8 different rivers with all of our gear. So we had to hire a lot of local porters and guides to help us get into this area. It is quite rugged, so really steep ridges and virgin rainforest in most places. And this is what our camp looked like when we got there. And we started to come across species that are similar to the black-naped pheasant pigeon, like this orange-footed scrub fowl, which, like the black-naped pheasant pigeon, is a terrestrial bird. So it's a bird that mostly just walks around on the ground. It only flies if it's flushed. If it starts to be fearful that it's being hunted by something. And we hadn't come across many of these orange-footed scrub fowl until we got to this area because they're the most commonly hunted bird species on this island, which is what we learned during our interview protocol. And so the fact that we were coming across a lot of these scrub fowl was a really good sign that, there are large ground-dwelling birds like the black-naped pheasant pigeon that are inhabiting these areas. That tells us there's probably not too much hunting pressure and that the habitat is pretty good. So we placed a handful of trail cameras just to boost our chances of finding this bird. And so for these, we really just leaned into this one particular hunter who knew the pheasant pigeon really well, or claimed to know the pheasant pigeon really well. We asked him, to help us find areas where we should put these cameras because we knew that with the few days we had left, there's a decent chance that we weren't able to get our eyes on it because they are quite elusive. But hopefully our cameras could document one, or we might be able to record them vocalizing. And again, just to give you a sense of what it looks like to walk around in these areas, this is along the quote unquote trail to get into this place. And this is along that trail that those people were telling us about who claimed to have come across the pheasant pigeon back in the 80s and 90s. They would follow this bush track to a coastal village that followed this really rugged, beautiful river. So there were parts where it was almost like a little bit of rock climbing to move around. You can see how big our team was.
It's dangerous, man.
Get all of our food here.
It's dangerous.
And help us, route find these areas. Okay, and this is what it looked like to cut camp for this trip. So this is Doka and Ellie who are clearing this patch of forest along the river where we had camped for a few days to try to look for the black-naped pheasant pigeon, the owl. Not only is Doka a really impressive biologist, but he's also great at clearing camp, and he will build furniture for us. So I'll show you in this video, you can see what it looks like at camp here along this really beautiful river. And so Doka made the table that you'll see in this video. He made this, how do I want to call it? This pot holder, I guess, over the fire. He was the one who tied the tarp to the trees. So not only was he, doing the heavy lifting of documenting birds on this trip and climbing trees to film nests, but he was also doing the heavy lifting with, being our local bush carpenter. And so we with our first couple of days, we spent a lot of time up on ridge lines using playback. So using a recording of the mainland species of pheasant pigeon, playing that with a Bluetooth speaker as loud as we could, hoping that we would hear a response from the black-naped pheasant pigeon. Because again, with this being an elusive bird, we thought, this is our best chance of documenting it. This is how most people document the mainland species of pheasant pigeon, is by hearing them on steep ridges, because their call kind of funnels up to the steep ridges from the valleys below. And so this is what it looked like to just kind of sit quietly and play this call. And over the first 48 hours of doing this, our high confidence that we were going to document this bird turned into just absolute despair, and this feeling that maybe we were playing the call of a species that had long went extinct. This is where the doubt started to creep back in, because each time you play this and you don't hear a response, you start to kind of lose the faith. So I think right around now is when a lot of us started to really doubt again whether or not this bird existed, and started to feel that if it did, we were running out of time. We only had a day or two left, and almost certainly we weren't going to end up documenting it on this trip. We're starting to deal with this feeling of failure. And on our second to last day, we ended up following the wrong river back to camp. And so at this point, we were following our guide, who was the guy who knew Awo, the pheasant pigeon, really well, or so he claimed, and we still totally believed him that he had these experiences with the pheasant pigeon. And he was really the only one who knew this forest, this really remote, rugged forest, really well. But even he got lost in this area, because these ridges are really steep, and there are rivers at the bottom of each valley, and they all kind of tend to look the same. And so here we are hiking along this river. At this point, we don't know yet that this is not the river that's going to lead us to camp. I'm playing this in part so you can just again get a sense of just how pristine this area is, and how difficult it is to travel here. So what you'll see is Doka carrying firewood that he's been carrying all morning, because it's so hard to find good dry firewood. He's carrying this firewood for so many hours up this river back to camp, which ended up being the wrong river.
like that at all.
This is before we realized that we were in the wrong river. So the morale, at least with Ellie, was pretty high. That was our translator. Feeling pretty good. So at some point, we realized that we are at a higher elevation than our camp. Again, this is the second to last day of our trip. So we're, just doing everything we can to search for this bird, trying to document it before we run out of time. But it was starting to get late in the day, and we were looking to get back to camp to have a small meal before going back out to continue the search. And a couple of things I want to say here. One is that we were, kind of running out of food because we had made arrangements with local people to access this really remote area, and they own the land. And so, though we were really, we wanted to hire a set number of guides and porters, that we had enough food, that we had brought enough food for. There were several people who, actually about 10 to 12 people, additional people who came along, who we couldn't tell to leave because that's their land. If they want to come with us, that they have every right to do that. But we didn't have enough food to, feed everyone to the level that we felt like we needed to, fuel these long days of searching. And so all of us were really tightly rationing the food that we had left. And so not only are we realizing here that we're lost, but we're, realizing we're lost on an empty stomach, and we still have a long ways to get back to camp, and we don't know exactly where camp is.
But just discovering that we are in the wrong river. Almost certainly in the wrong river. We have to be. We're at 1,000 meters right now.
What?
You brought us to the wrong river. We're at 1,000 meters.
I'll try and get.
Ellie! Woo!
We're
We're at 1,000 meters.
1,000 meters.
Our camp is at 870.
Holy shit.
We're in the wrong river.
Okay, and then this is shortly after this point. Now we're starting we think that we know where camp is, and so we're going to climb this ridge to drop down to the next river, which is where we think our camp is. And Ellie found this palm that is apparently edible. And so this is him sharing this palm with us, with me. At this point, we've been hiking around for 8 or 9 hours, and I'd had a single spoonful of peanut butter that morning, and Elliot had one little biscuit, one little cracker to start the day, because we had to ration our food so tightly because we had such a big group of people who we were trying to feed.
Ellie is finding food in the bush. Ellie, what have you eaten today?
It's a palm like black palm.
Ah,
It's sweet.
can I try some?
It's there.
What did you eat? What have you eaten before this?
What do you say?
What have you eaten before this today?
Oh, I had a biscuit. Yeah, so I'm hungry.
A single biscuit.
Yeah.
It's now 1:30. All right, I'm gonna try it.
Just a little bit, not all of it.
All right. Oh, it's pretty good.
No, man, it's not ready yet.
Okay. It's pretty sweet.
It's not ready. That's why it's not sweet.
Now we have the energy
Go find a
to
bigger
get back to camp.
And somewhere along, just to give you a sense of, the kind of damage that accrues on our bodies while we're covering this terrain, because you spend so much time in really wet boots because we have to do so many river crossings, and there are so many insects, leeches and mosquitoes. Sorry, I should have given you a trigger warning before showing this image. You can look away if you have to. I'm going to cover it in a second. This is what my legs look like at the end of this search for the pheasant pigeon. And probably around the time that these videos were taken is when I was probably bitten by a mosquito that, a month and a half later gave me malaria. And so this is me on the floor of the emergency room in Ithaca with my girlfriend at the time, who's now my fiance, who fortunately took care of me during this time. It's the sickest I've ever been. And this is from a mosquito bite, during this expedition. So even though I was taking anti-malarials, there was a mosquito that was able to transmit malaria to me, despite that. That was, it's just one of many costs of, embarking on a trip like this. There are quite a lot of hazards of doing this kind of work. And the last thing we had to do, so those videos I was showing you of us being lost looking for camp, that was our second to last day. At this point, we've really all given up hope in finding the bird. We're still trusting our local guide that he is accurate in saying that this bird is on his land, but clearly we didn't have enough time to document such an elusive species. Like I had said earlier, there were just a handful of trail cameras that we had left in the forest. Most of these have only been up for about 48 hours, so not really a high probability of detecting any species. I'll just let this video speak for itself. Some of you may have already seen this video before, but this is the moment that I start scrolling through this trail camera. At the time, I was scrolling through it just because I was tired. I just climbed up this ridgeline. It was the last thing we had to do before hiking out of this area and giving up on our search. And I was tired and kind of beaten down both physically and mentally. And I just started absentmindedly scrolling through the photos and realizing what we had. And so this is when I called over Doka, who had hiked with me to fetch this trail camera. And if you haven't seen it before, you'll see Doka just go through all these stages of disbelief and then relief and excitement that, our mission had, against all odds, succeeded. There is some colorful language here. None of us were, neither Doka or I were really thinking at the moment that this video was going to be shared with, as it turns out, millions of people have now seen this video. So just a warning that there is a lot of cursing that you'll hear here.
Maybe just hit the side arrow. Fuck. Doka.
Fuck.
Doka.
What is this?
It's owl.
Fuck.
Isn't it owl? We can't tell them. We have to have them look through the photos too. We say nothing.
Hey, we get it.
Holy shit, man.
Shit. Oh man, this is the happiest moment ever.
Oh my god.
Oh man, can you just play it back? Man. Shit, my legs are shivering.
I can't believe it.
God. Jordan, that's an owl.
So you can see how much it meant to Doka to have this mission succeed. I don't think he's ever failed at anything in his life. And he, like the rest of us, was finally, feeling that, okay, it's time for us to give up on this search. We're heading back. And somehow one of our trail cameras, got this image of the bird. And just to give you a sense of what it looked like on this tiny LCD screen, even though it was hard to really see it because the screen is so small, it was so unmistakably matching the one illustration we had of the bird. So here's the illustration, and then here's what the bird looked like. And so it was just unmistakable. There's nothing else that this could be. And this is when we brought the trail camera back to camp and showed it to Jason and others, and didn't tell them what we had, and they got to experience this incredible moment as well. As Doka said, it was the happiest moment ever. I don't think any of us had ever been a part of something like this that was just so unbelievable in the moment. it really felt like we had hit the lottery. And I'm conscious of the time here. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So let's quickly show you a video that we got of the bird from another trail camera. So it's quite a remarkable looking bird. You can see why it's called a pheasant pigeon. It has, kind of the face of a pigeon, and it is in the pigeon family, but it resembles in a lot of ways a pheasant, behaves a lot like a pheasant, and kind of has the body shape of a pheasant. I'm just going to quickly skip through this, but it got quite a lot of coverage. So all over social media, there are just millions of views. This is on YouTube. And there's a lot of news coverage around the globe for this. I think because it was a species that hadn't been documented for so long, it gave people a lot of hope that there are other species out there that maybe we've given up hope in finding that might still be around. One thing I just want to highlight at the end here is that there's a lot of terminology that I think really minimizes local knowledge. And so the way in which we documented this species is that we found local partners who knew this species to present day. So for them, it wasn't something that needed to be rediscovered. And also they were making sightings. So to say that it hadn't been sighted for 140 years isn't accurate either. There are local people who are seeing this bird. And that's something that we're always careful to talk about when we, share how this project ended up succeeding. But unfortunately, a lot of the news coverage, 95% of it was stemming from original articles and kind of repurposing that material instead of talking with us. And so that's something I always want to tell people at the end of this story is that, this project worked because of the immense natural history knowledge that locals on Ferguson Island have. And we tapped into that, and we were able to use modern technology to kind of validate what these people were telling us, who didn't have the capacity to, capture images of the bird with the kind of technology that we had. And specifically, it's these local people who knew this bird really well. And to them, it wasn't something that had, gone extinct or needed to be rediscovered. This was a bird that was on their land. So with that, I have a lot of people to acknowledge who were part of this expedition team. And if you want to follow along more with this story, I'll steadily be releasing more videos on this YouTube channel, kind of showing what it looked like to go look for this species. So the time we have left, I'll take any questions, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jordan. We appreciate you sharing that with us. I want to invite anyone who's on the call, if they have a question, they can either type it in the chat window at the bottom of your screen, or you are welcome to come off mute and ask a question. And while we're waiting for those people to do that, I just have one for you, Jordan, specifically about your trail cams. How did you identify locations, and are they motion activated? Is that how you were able to capture that video in such a short span of 48 hours?
Yeah, exactly. So they're motion activated, and for the most part, we set cameras in places where that one local guide told us had recent tracks of awo, the pheasant pigeon. And so that is something I meant to mention, that to me, I've been doing bird research, wildlife research for a long time. I'm not an experienced tracker, but I have some idea of what tracks look like on the ground. I looked down on the ground where we ended up getting images of the bird, and I could see nothing on the forest floor. But to him, it was so clear that there was a bird that had walked through there that had displaced some leaves on the ground in a way that was consistent with this one particular bird. And this is, it speaks to the power of finding the right local partners and really putting your trust in them. In many ways, it looked like a really bad place to set a trail camera because it had a really narrow field of view. But he was totally right. The 2 mornings, he said when we set the trail camera that morning, an owl had walked right through there. The next morning, we got images of the bird. The next morning, we got images of the bird, and then we picked up the trail camera. So they were clearly consistently walking right along that ridgeline, like he said.
It's impressive. I want to go to Ralph Fairbanks. Ralph, you're unmuted. You're welcome to ask your question for Jordan, please.
Yes, hi, Jordan. I was just wondering, is that land being logged now since you left?
Good question. So that's part of why we're going back in May. We don't know. So from what we were told, it was going to have that nobody knew when the company was going to show up and start their work. There was some speculation that the slopes are too steep to allow logging in that particular area. At least where we, right where we documented the AWO. But that land generally had been leased over. So I think anything that wasn't too steep for them to, get their gear in, is at risk. And so, we've been in communication with the government trying to find ways to work with local people to set that land aside and kind of replace the economic benefit that they would get for logging. There's a lot of interest from locals to pursue such an arrangement. It's hard to do that from afar because we can't actually communicate with anyone on Ferguson from here because there's no cell service. So that's why we just need to go back to see what the current situation is and, work with our local partners to try to help conserve that area.
Thanks, Ralph. And that appears to match another question from Barbanet Goodman. If that does not fully answer your question, Barbanet, please let us know in the comments there in the chat window. Looks like Steve Hebberg's come off mute. Steve, you have a question for Jordan?
Well, first of all, congratulations that you were able to find this bird again, and kudos to your persistence at it. I've been on Ferguson Island. I have seen several of the birds there, was unaware that this bird was still in existence when I was there. Otherwise, well, I'm not sure if we would have gone to that extent to find it. I have looked for the pheasant pigeon at Sarong over in West Papua, and I can certainly appreciate the efforts that you have to put forth to do all the climbing, the camping, the hunger, the sweat, everything. It's just a I don't know. It requires a certain person, I think. And again, congratulations at your finds.
Wow, I was not expecting anyone in this group to have been to Ferguson Island. I have talked with a lot of groups about this, and you're the first who's that's incredible.
Yeah, I saw Goldie's bird paradise there, and the crinkle curled manicote.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, nice. I'm glad you shared that.
Glad you two could get connected. I wanted to introduce the two of you. Steve is a globally ranked birder, and happily to have him local to HASP here. Jordan, one more question that came in asking about have there been any additional sightings documented since? And how do you balance your discovery with the interest of people now wanting to go to the location to get their own version or their own glimpse of this?
Yeah, great question. So no, there are no eBird records, which would be the one way that we would see that someone had documented it. I'm assuming that no one has come across it and not put it on eBird, because there really aren't many birders who go to Ferguson Island, and to go to where we went for this bird, it's not along the quote unquote birding trail there, which is already, as Steve would know, is it's not very well established. And people generally just go for the Goldie's bird of paradise. So we don't think that anyone has gone there to see the pheasant pigeon. Whether or not any of the local hunters we work with have come across it since we left, I assume that Augustine, who is the one who guided us at the end, who is the biggest key to unlocking this, probably he's come across it. But of course he wouldn't be putting his observations on eBird. So, and again, we have no ability to communicate with people in that area, unfortunately. Sorry, I'm forgetting the second part of that.
Well, meaning, do you have any concern that people will be going there to try to find this? Clearly, there hasn't been, and it's in the 4 years since you've been there.
Yeah, so I think it'd be great if people want to go there to see it. That is something we chatted with locals about. So from working in New Guinea for a long time, everywhere where I've worked, I've been approached by people to ask for help in recruiting other researchers and eco-tourists to their land. Because again, the land is almost always privately owned, and it's really hard to benefit from the land economically, if not for selling or leasing to a logging company or to an oil palm company. And generally what I've come across is people are really reticent to do that because they understand that it tends to degrade, if not totally destroy the land, both currently and in the future for gardening. And because it's largely subsistence living, as much as that payment is beneficial for a short period of time, the primary landowners for these tracts of land are really thinking long term about future generations and the benefit that they'll get. And so they really don't come to those arrangements lightly with leasing to a logging or oil palm company. It really is a last resort. And there's a lot of interest in ecotourism there. It's really hard to navigate because of the communication issue, but also because it's really hard to get to these places, not only for the reasons that I showed with my slides and videos, but also piracy is a major concern. So I try not to highlight this too much, but we actually were trailed briefly by pirates at the end of our trip when we were going back to where we were going to fly out. And so that's a concern. So we would love if the security situation improves to help encourage people to go there as ecotourists and pay the people we worked with as guides and porters to go see this bird and have that money, offset what could be earned from logging. I mean, that would be a great solution in my mind, but remains to be seen whether or not that can be accomplished.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna, if any of you have any additional questions for Jordan, you're welcome to share them with hasp@hope.edu. Email them to us. We'd be happy to relay them to Jordan. And at this time, I'll ask Gordon Stedgink, our coordinator, to come off mute and close us out for today.
Thank you, Jordan. It was great. And I think it's a better mystery program than anything I can see on TV. So it's way to go. And we're looking forward to having Jordan back for further adventures in the future. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Good to be with you.
Great class. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Bye. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Gordon. We'll make sure we process the recording for you, okay?
You bet. Thanks, Ian.
Yep. Have a good afternoon.
You too.